All right, today we're going to be talking about the triangle trade, which is a part of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, if you look at this picture, you're probably wondering what it is, or thinking what it is, and it's sailors tying down African slaves into the hold of a ship for transit. Now, this is treating humans the same way you would treat any cargo, not very well, because they're not seeing them as people, they're seeing them as commodities. And some of the causes are mercantilism. And that's where colonies are formed by countries to serve as a source of raw materials and the market for the finished goods. So you would have cotton picked in the New World, send it back to Europe, where it would be turned into clothing. The clothing would be sold back to the colonists. The other cause is encomienda, where the Spanish would grant it to attract colonists, granted land to Spaniards, and in return for this large land grant, they would also be given the natives who lived on that land, and they would be turned into basically slave labor. You mix that with disease and the brutal policy and treatment under encomienda, and you run out of natives. So the Spaniards are short on labor. They need people, specifically slaves, to do this grueling work. They don't have any more natives, so they turn to Africans to do the work. And the using Africans for slaves starts back in between the 10th and 14th century, where Arab merchants would trade for slaves in Sudan. And this is one of the first times we see Africans specifically being targeted, because you remember from Greece and Rome, slaves were primarily prisoners of war and not racially based. But here we're starting to see a racial motive for it. From Sudan, they go northwest to Morocco on the edge of Europe, and even Spanish and Portuguese start buying these slaves. And by the mid-1400s, the Portuguese are actually in the slave trading business and using slave labor along the west coast of Africa that they're claiming as their own. As you know, in 1492, Columbus reaches the New World, and this can be the beginning of the slave trade. He is followed by the Spaniards and the conquistadors seeking those 3 G's: gold, glory, God. And the natives are already weakened by the disease and their treatment under the Spanish. So in 1520, only less than 30 years after Columbus has reached America, the first ships arrive with African slaves. Here's a map of what the triangle trade would have looked like. You can see that the slaves are brought along to the Americas from Africa, and then back from and then the slaves harvest things such as sugar, cotton, rum, tobacco, and coffee, which are brought back to Europe. The Middle Passage is where the slaves are taken back, and things that are traded for slaves in Africa include rum, pots, pans, horses. Basic things are traded for people, and they're brought to America on the Middle Passage. So if you think about what do you think life would be like on this trip, and remember, it's about a 3 to 4 month trip at best from Africa to the Americas. And that's with good wind. Sometimes if you lose the wind, you're stuck out at sea, and these people are chained down. So the conditions are horrible. They're packed into ships on wooden platforms, and the decks are generally around 4 by 6, little headroom. So you're going to be scuffed up with scrapes, bruises. You're basically living there permanently, so you're going to very prone to infections, and you're living in just unsanitary conditions. And here's a diagram of what it would have looked like, where people are stacked up just like cargo. You're also going to be confined with leg irons, and to keep you moving, you're probably going to be whipped and beaten, and you're tied down with iron collars. Conditions are very crowded, unsanitary. It is a nasty place to be. And because of this, many do die on the way. And some would even commit suicide. And also another idea some had was to not eat, and they would just feed them with iron poles, force feed them. So it is probably one of the most brutal conditions anyone could ever imagine or live through. Now, 15 to 20% of the slaves die on the journey. And remember, 3 months is the minimum. It's probably between 3 to 6. Thank you.